Austin, Texas is widely regarded as a leading center for development of cutting-edge technology and a vibrant startup culture. In an election year, how do Austin's candidates for public office deal with issues confronting the tech world? EFF Austin decided to find out, inviting local candidates for the U.S. Congress and Texas Senate to participate in a tech forum explaining how they will craft the laws and policies relating to technology that the 21st century will require. While the Democrats were happy to participate, their Republican opponents were a no-show at Austin's B.D. Riley's Irish Pub. This time, on the Plutopia News Network's podcast, 20 Minutes into the Future, candidates Joseph Kopser and Stephen Klink respond to questions posed by EFF Austin President Kevin Welch.
We're here today because we realized we had a unique opportunity that in our local area here in Texas, we had not one, but two politicians to be maybe, candidates running for office who have backgrounds in the tech industry, which is a lot rarer than it should be, actually. For those of you who follow the news and follow how it really seems every day there's new technologies without laws in place to govern the responsible uses of those new technologies, it really, one can ask, where are the candidates with the knowledge and expertise to actually address these issues and legislate for the 21st century? So I am honored to be here with Joseph Kopser, running for U.S. House of Representatives District 25, I believe. 21, thank you, sorry, 21. And Steve Kling for Texas State Senate District 25. That's where I got the 25. I am going to turn things briefly over to both candidates to give a little introduction about their backgrounds in the tech industry and why they're here today because of said backgrounds. Why don't we start with you, Joseph?
Okay, I'm picking this up?
Yes.
Okay, let me know if you can or can't hear me. My name is Joseph Kopser, running for Congress to replace Lamar Smith, who in the world of technology is important to all of us because he is the current chair of the House Science and Technology Committee. I like to point out, I'm not sure how much of a fan he is of either science or technology, but I apologize, that was a snarky little dig.
I'll allow it.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of my background in technology, it really started as a kid. I was one of those people that with the space shuttle program coming into its infancy in the late 70s, early 80s, that's what turned me on to science and tech. I was an aerospace engineer at West Point, but the key theme through that all the way to today is I'm a problem solver. So for my senior thesis design at West Point, I wanted to be able to take my future job, which was as a cavalry officer, and apply it to technology. And so I designed a tank-carrying glider that I can tell you about later on. We can look it up. It's actually on the internet. Made the internet, got published.
You will let people know where that is.
Yes,
right?
just Google it and you'll find it. Tank-carrying glider with my last name, Kopser. But all throughout my 20 years in the Army, I always found myself either being the one person in my Army unit that was incorporating all the latest office technologies in terms of use of internet or computers and whatnot and linking things together, or then ultimately an actual Army transformation from the technologies of the past to the technologies of the future. And then of course, the company that I built here in Austin, Ride Scout, after it was acquired by Mercedes-Benz, we literally were upstairs. So as I was saying earlier on our live podcast, I would come down here to B.D. Riley's to talk with our team about important issues, and to be back with you all today at B.D. Riley's talking about important issues. That's just way cool, way cool. So that's my story.
Awesome. All right, Steve, your turn.
All right, well, my name is Stephen Kling. I'm also share Joseph's enthusiasm for being here and for this topic specifically. My love affair with technology started with a Commodore VIC-20 and a TI-99 4A and a tape backup, right?
Did William Shatner convince you to buy that Commodore VIC-20?
Shatner may have had a small role in that influence, actually. So, I mean, I grew up a geek. I was so steeped in geek, I didn't even know I was one until I found out later. But you know, it was one of those things where I grew up with this industry. You know, I grew up with the internet. I had a Juno account. I had a Prodigy account. And, you know, yes, it's going that far back. But I have also, because of that, I've had a front row seat to all of the innovations that have taken place in the last 23 years since I graduated from college. I have been worked from large companies like EDS, who is well known in this industry, is basically inventing software, and I've worked pretty much since then in a series of startups, as you would expect for someone who started their career in the late '90s and early 2000s in the .com boom. Started a couple of different companies, and I currently work as a partner and co-owner of a boutique consulting firm. So these are issues that are near and dear to my heart, and I'm one of the few candidates that I see out on the trail very often that really talks about technology and the job displacements that are coming and the need to embrace those and have people in this industry in government. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here. This is a topic really near and dear to my heart.
Well, we are honored to have both of you, and thank both of you for your service. We appreciate your commitment to public good. So I'm going to start with, I hope, an easy question. So, my question to both of you is, how do you think your background in the technology sector informs the approach you will take to laws and regulations surrounding technology?
So my background with technology, much like Steve, is just that I have grown up with it. And so the understanding is that technology allows us to do things in a way that many of us have never been able to do before in business or home or communications. But it also presents great risks. And there's a lot of vulnerability, whether it be with data or privacy. And because I've grown up with it, I can see both sides of the perspective. In a recent podcast or a recent video on Science Channel that I encourage anyone to check out, I gave basically my argument for why we need to be in elected office, and that the generation of leadership that got there in the 80s, when I was learning to program on an IBM PC Junior, that generation that's been there for 40 years needs to move on to the next chapter in their life. And so what's going to inform me is an understanding that for the people making the decisions on how this stuff works, probably should have a better firsthand account of how it actually became into existence, and that's what I would like to do.
So I would start the answer to that question with those who saw the Zuckerberg committee hearing have to have come away with a really profound realization of how much our current leadership does not have any clue about our industry. I've taken to say that technology is a double-edged sword. You know, it giveth it, it taketh away. My joke is that technology gave us the internet, but on the other hand, it gave us the internet. And the fact is, I mean, every new invention can be in our sector can be used to benefit society, and it can be used to destroy us. Our 2016 election is a perfect example of how a foreign government, as well as operators here in the United States, is frankly agnostic to geography, as our industry has become, but was able to wage a successful psychological operations campaign like the world's never seen before. And we're just not ready for it. Our regulatory environment is not prepared. And frankly, the real concern is, even if people like Joseph and I took over and snapped our fingers and brought us up to speed tomorrow, the pace of technological change is so much faster than our ability to regulate it, that really is the biggest concern that we have. You know, the answer to your question ultimately is another question, and that is, where do you start? There are so many different avenues and directions we could take that answer.
Awesome. Okay. Now I'm going to start pivoting to more specific issues of particular topics in tech law that are coming up in the news lately. So for those of us who follow these issues, we're well aware that there is often a regulatory control battle around these issues, that we see states preempting local control. We see the federal government preempting state control. We see states trying to wrestle back that control, only for the federal government to turn around and do it again. Two areas that this has come up a lot in the news recently is states trying to ban municipalities from establishing municipal city-owned broadband. And another place we see it come up is in the ongoing battle around net neutrality, where the FCC rolled back the Title II regulations. California just passed a bill, Governor Jerry Brown just signed it to reinstate them. Now Ajit Pai and the FCC are threatening to sue California over it. My question to you is, what is the proper balance of federal versus state or local regulation when it comes to issues like municipal broadband or net neutrality?
All right, well, let's start with municipal broadband. And I think the role of the federal government there is to provide a lot of the funding, the way we saw with rural electrification. I think that's probably the best parallel there, and then to allow the states to regulate it, or allow the states to administrate it. But when it comes to net neutrality, that's such a difficult issue at the state level. When you read articles about California has reinstituted net neutrality, the first question in my mind is how. And most importantly, how do they do that without actually hurting the businesses within California itself and forcing them to relocate? And then a follow-on question is it's fairly easy actually to relocate in those scenarios. We are living in a geographically agnostic technological world, and it requires centralization in terms of regulation in order for this to work properly. You can't ultimately have a patchwork where in one state there are regulations as to whether or not you can collect people's personal data, and another state where you can't. That'll ultimately just mean that companies that want to collect that data, like our big communications firms, your Time Warners, etc., they're just simply going to relocate and take that commerce elsewhere, and then punish those states that are trying to protect their people's personal information.
So in Texas 21, you have to understand the geography to know why the broadband question is so important. So it's Austin all the way down to San Antonio, all the way out I-10 through Bandera, Kerrville, into Leakey, which is Real County, up to Fredericksburg, back along the 290 Wine Trail, through Johnson City, and then back into Austin, Texas.
Those people all have so much in common.
Exactly. Well, let's hope their commonality is voting Kopser for Congress.
That's right.
And if my opponent was here, as he was invited, he could have made the case.
Yes, I should say for those, I think I forgot to say it earlier, but both of their opponents, Donna Campbell and Chip Roy, were invited to this. We are a nonpartisan organization. We care about smart tech policy, regardless of who it comes from. So both of their Republican opponents were invited to participate in this conversation. We did not even hear a peep from either of them, so take from that what you will.
So back to the idea of broadband in the Hill Country. This is an example where there is a very clear precedent, and it actually came from this part of the country. It was LBJ, when he was a member of Congress, said to bring the Hill Country into the 20th century, it needed to have electricity for homes, for cooking, for safety. They needed electricity, and there was no incentive for the private market, private utility, electrical providers to come and lay the wire, to come and lay the infrastructure to put it in. So he, in working with the presidency at that time, FDR, enabled the Rural Electrification Act that created cooperatives that provide a member-owned ability to be able to deliver electricity. The same thing, it's so perfectly similar, should be happening with broadband. And again, I believe that the federal government should facilitate it and do everything they can to prevent organizations, whether they're companies like big-time providers like AT&T and Comcast, or state levels organizations to come in and try to choke off that ability for them to extend it. On the idea of net neutrality, it's another great example where, as Steve said, technology is geographically agnostic. We've already been through this drill before with sales tax. If you remember the early days of internet sales, we said, well, let's have no sales tax assessed because this is an experiment. We don't know if the internet will take off. Well, it did. It took off. It's doing just fine. Now we got to go back and look at a more holistic approach without all these pockets of different standards. However, to any lawmaker, I tell you, similar thing that he said, if you try to create different pockets, technology will find a way around that because, again, digits don't care what state lines it is in. Now, you can create geofencing that those digits act differently, but in the end of the day, technology will always move faster than lawmakers. So our first goal should be to make policy that is more understanding of the fact that we don't understand these, or that the digits don't care about the boundaries as much as lawmakers or special interest groups do.
What do you think about the First and Fourth Amendment issues surrounding the use of drones in public and private airspace by governmental entities, corporations, and private citizens? I was prompted to ask this question by hearing stories that There are certain law enforcement agencies who have straight up said that they will shoot down private citizens' drones with no prior warning or informing that they're doing anything wrong. I've also heard instances, this actually came up recently, where there was, I think it was a bill in the last legislative session that was attempting to ban drones flying over factory farms from the press to document animal abuses, which is a blatant First Amendment violation. So I'm curious, now at the same time, there's the issue of drones might be flying over people's backyards, which I think most of us are not okay with. So what do you guys think about how we balance these First and Fourth Amendment needs when it comes to drones in our skies?
Right, so the other thing that you didn't say in addition to First Amendment and Fourth Amendment is overall public safety. So let me begin with one of the most contentious issues right now is the use of drones in close vicinity to aviation, specifically commercial aviation, whether it be moving cargo or people. We do have to use technology to geo-fence to be able to prevent drones from being too close to any kind of commercial or passenger aviation areas. If we do that properly, then we won't have to go the draconian route that so many people want to do, which is to require licensing or certification for enthusiast or hobby drones. I don't want to see that have to come. But in terms of drones, they should be treated like eyeballs and respecting First Amendment or Fourth Amendment rights. So let's talk about First Amendment. If it is sociably or politically acceptable for you to climb up on a ladder and peer over your neighbor's fence and look at what they're doing and you get away with it, well, that would be the same thing as you launching a drone over top of their area, over their pool or over their farm. So I'm not a big fan of making it so that you can take your drone and move over. Now, however, on the public safety side, if there is cause for concern, or if there is a warrant that needs to be served, or if there is a reason to tell the authorities, I would like to see the authorities involved. So in the area of private enthusiasts being able to fly wherever they want and capture anyone's area, it's an issue that we still need to discuss. But in terms of law enforcement being able to have a much better ability to be able to get up and surveil, I kind of go in the direction of London, which has seen a huge drop off in crime because of the increased number of cameras in their cities. There will always be, and I'll end on this note, always be a tug and trade between privacy and security. And luckily we have groups like the American Civil Liberties Union that are at the forefront of that, try to find the right balance. I'm not in favor of programs like Gator. If you'll remember, that was after 9/11, and Gator was a program by the NSA that gobbled up every single phone number and every single phone call and every single text message sent by every American. And luckily that was pulled back. But again, there is always going to be a balance between safety and privacy.
Yeah, so my initial thought to open with is a statement of you always err on the side of personal privacy, period. In this day and age, you always err on the side of personal privacy. There are so many different technologies now that lend themselves to abuses of the First and Fourth Amendment. I've never heard it put that way, Joseph, but I really like your analogy of eyeballs. I mean, I think that's, if you're looking in someone's window, you're a peeping Tom. If you're looking in someone's window with a drone, you're a peeping Tom. But there's, and you're talking to someone who probably thinks about these things way too much, actually, but there is a certain altitude in which personal, identifiable facial features and things of that nature, a certain resolution, yada yada, are obfuscated to the point where it becomes less of an issue. And so those are small regulatory kinds of minutia that have to be considered in this. And what I'm thinking of in the back of my head when I talk about that is there was a technology we used in Iraq. And actually, Joseph, you may remember the name of it. It's not coming to me right now.
Constant Hawk?
Constant Hawk, actually. And it's being deployed by police, departments around the United States now. And it effectively has the ability to record a specific area of an urban environment. And to retroactively go back
By reviewing the tape.
By reviewing the tape. So if an incident happens, they can say, all right, well, this particular incident happened at this time. They go back, review the tape, and they can actually follow the vehicle that robbed the bank back from, not from the point that it actually came from. So it has a lot of value there. It just has to be very closely monitored. And in an age, and particularly a government, where if you'd asked me 10, 15 years ago, I may have given you a different answer. at this day and age, when we're seeing a government that seems to be very much in a post-truth, ends justifies the means state of action, it's never been more important to preserve the privacy of American citizens.
Okay, now leading off of that, my next question for you guys is, what data should governments and corporations be allowed to collect on us via websites and devices? What regulations should there be to prevent data aggregation abuses? How do we stop things like Cambridge Analytica? How do we prevent there being giant silos of data that are being sold on the third-party market that become national security risks by the very fact that you have, say, all the personal information of all people with top secret clearance in the US just sitting in some company's data center somewhere? What would you guys propose as remedies to these problems?
Well, I mean, it has to be regulated. I mean, everyone knows of the EULA agreement that you look at. That's 50 pages long that you scroll through and accept before you join a social media program. Before you join a social media site. That has been obviously taken advantage of to our detriment for a long time now. So it's important that we have policymakers that are not looking out for the profit incentive of the people that are writing those 50-page EULAs and launching these sites, and have the sole perspective of protecting the privacy of individuals. It's a free country. I'm not opposed to the idea of you being able to make information available to you, but I think there has to be some creative measures put in place that make it very obvious as to what information that you're making publicly available and what information that is privately available or not available, and what information is available to a government with a proper, with a proper warrant that can be ultimately used against you. I mean, again, that's a very difficult question to ask in a short period of time, but these are the questions that regulators, that policymakers of the 21st century have to wrestle with.
So it is not only a hard topic, but I think it's important to have anecdotes that show that this is not a new idea, though. We have struggled with this balance between being out there and available with the need for privacy or owning your own data. And I want to encourage the audience that's here today, or even the listeners of this podcast, to look at a historical example in Hollywood that had a very humorous angle that shows just how difficult this is. It comes from one of my favorite movies of all time, The Jerk by Steve Martin. And there's a ridiculous ridiculous scene in the movie where he has just started a new job working at a gas station. The mail comes that day and they drop off a phone book. Steve Martin, who is penniless, is so excited because now his name is listed in the phone book. In other words, his data is now publicly available. And for a couple of moments in the scene, he's just so excited. He says, "Don't you know what this means? Millions of people read this every day. Now he's famous." And he's super excited. However, at the exact same moment, a serial killer is going through the phone book and picks out his name, Nevin Johnson, and then drives to his location and sits atop of a hill and starts shooting at him. And Steve Martin is standing there and all the oil cans start popping and then the soda cans start popping, and he thinks, my God, this man hates cans, to Steve's point. And the reason why I say it's important to keep this humorous anecdote in mind, which is we have always struggled with how much are you willing to pay, like Steve Martin, to get your name in the phone book, to be out there and to be available to take advantage of all these opportunities. We allowed, whether it was with Gmail when it first became one of the first free emails, there were others, one of the first free emails, we thought, this is awesome. Free email. I don't have to pay AOL $7.99, or I can't remember what I paid them every month, but I don't have to pay for it. But what we were forgetting is that we, the people, were the commodity. We were the valuable data. It was our habits, our use that they were selling, and we only figured it out as a general population. Now, those of us in tech knew what was going on. It was the monetization of this data. And so what I want to see is a new paradigm. If people are the data, if we are the value, I want to see individual people actually participate in that, have a lot more say in what their valuable data is doing, but then ultimately allow cities, who are one of the greatest collectors of public data, use that. You know, if oil was the money of the 20th century, data is the oil of the 21st century. I want to see cities and municipalities figure out a way, working with citizens through lower taxes, to have better control of their data, using it with private industry who want to do good with that data. So there's a way to get a check and a balance on it. But right now, we just need to remember this is not our first rodeo. We have been around this block before. And Steve Martin is a good example of that.
So this is one that I feel has been getting a lot of news lately due to a certain occupant in the White House's enjoyment of this phrase, although he did not coin it. What can we do to reduce the spread of, and I actually hate this term, by the way, for reasons I won't get into right now. What can we do to reduce the spread of fake news in digital communities while not trampling on people's First Amendment rights? A lot of people have been very happy to see people like Alex Jones get kicked off all the content platforms. And now, I'm happy about it too. I'm not a fan of Alex Jones. But we can't deny there are some troubling questions raised by having private unelected corporations as the gatekeepers of news and truth and falsehood in the internet, which has become a prime public space, even if it is not regulated that way. And for every Alex Jones, I can cite you plenty of people on the other side of the political spectrum who've been kicked off these platforms too. So what are your thoughts on how we tamp down on falsehoods, but still let people speak truth to power?
So by way of history and anecdote, I want to remind everyone that in the late 1800s, when there was problems and issues with Cuba around who owned what land in the Caribbean, the president at the time was concerned, and so the press and the New York Times and others started to get involved. And a reporter went from New York down to Havana Harbor and saw the USS Maine and the other things that had just occurred and said, there's actually no war here. There's not a conflict. And then he said, you just send me the pictures and I'll give you the war. So fake news is, again, not new. The issues that we're dealing with today are not new. So by looking to history, we can find some way to look to the future. To the specific point about the digital side of it, I must say there is almost no digital solution for the fake news problem other than personal discipline. And it's about education, about recognizing that you have to look at different news sources, because if not, people are already self-selecting what news they want to be looking at. It goes back to the 1980s regulation that was withdrawn under the Reagan administration that used to require equal airtime under the FCC. When that was pulled, then radio hosts like Rush Limbaugh could get on a major carrier and talk for 3 hours about anything he wanted, and there was no need anymore for balance. So the question is, do we want to regulate balance, or do we want to regulate good citizenship, or not regulate, but encourage good citizenship, which is to be informed, look at other sources, push back and question. Because I would not want to get into a case where the government is able to go in and pick winners and losers of free speech. I think it was the right thing for private providers of content to remove anybody they want. And if Alex Jones wants to create his own new location on the internet, let them go do it. For anybody that complains that Google has too much power, fine. For your next search, just go Bing it. Just go Bing it.
DuckDuckGo.
Absolutely.
I will also plug Startpage.
Startpage.
There's other great options.
There are plenty. We are not forced to use their platforms.
Well, this is, man, that's a tough question, and I'm afraid the tough answer is, however, we have to start teaching critical thinking. We seem to have lost our ability to critical think in this country. For me, it is about free speech with the limitation of if you are spouting falsehoods, you should expect it to be called out for that. And there are a lot of organizations out there that volunteer to be ombudsmen for those types of for those things. But I think we're looking at what we really ultimately need is a way to rate the source. And if there's an upside to having virtual monopolies of eyeballs in terms of Twitter and Facebook and things like that, the upside to that is their ability to begin to rate the level of veracity of the content that you're seeing, and allowing volunteer organizations to be able to rate that. The Pinocchios come to mind, for instance, the Washington Post. That is an example of something I would see, or PolitiFact is another that comes to mind, where you think there are organizations that can go out there and start to regulate the veracity of that content. It's a fascinating question. I mean, you go back to the guy that's screaming on the street corner. At what point does it become a threat to society to the point where he's shut down? But in the old days, the police would come, maybe take him away, and but now it's up to a privately held corporation as to whether or not they allow them the bandwidth. It's a brave new world.
Yeah. Can I just add one more thing?
Oh, yes.
So, because we're in a tech forum and we have a lot of tech folks that are here, as well as people on the podcast that are listening in, I have heard of companies that are trying, and I encourage all of the listeners to go forward and do this faster, that just like a television might have closed caption at the bottom, I would love to be able to have an instant fact checker button where I could just turn that button on, and through artificial intelligence and Watson and blockchain, meshing them all together, I want to be able to see, as a talk show pundit is talking, not only whether or not that statement is correct, but I want to see, and somebody can do this, I want to see their accuracy over time. Like, in other words, this pundit, 35% of the time, pure bullshit. 80% of the time, accurate. You know what I mean? Like some kind of rating. And then the more that pundits would have that underneath their banner, it might influence behavior to know that they're 20% full of bullshit.
Yeah, you give me an idea. It's almost like the closed captioning. You could just turn that on. I think we need to start a company after
That's it.
Well, I will say it's certainly make my job as a moderator easier if I could real-time check what both of you are telling me right now.
There you go.
Well, the one thing I want to add to it as well is that we are looking at technologies now that can real-time change the facial topography of videos that were recorded decades ago. We are looking at technology that can take a voice sampling of you saying just a few words and actually faithfully reproduce the sound of your voice.
In fact, I will inject real quick to say that deep fakes. I have a question for both of you. How do we guard against deep fakes?
Well, that's just it. I mean, for every technology that comes, it's like the chess game. It's like the game that we played with insurgents in Iraq. We would come up with a defeat mechanism, and they would come up with a way to overcome the defeat mechanism.
Maybe I will rephrase that then. What do we do about people who will accept a video at first glance and they will not do the research to check, is this a deep fake? Because it sure seems like this person I hate is saying exactly what I want them to say.
Well, Joseph said it. It's self-selection, right? This is a human nature problem that we're dealing with that I don't know that technology has an answer for ultimately, and that's because people will pick the truth, quote unquote, that makes them feel comfortable. And that is the propaganda of the new world. The old propaganda was state monopolization of information. The new propaganda is so many versions of the truth that you can't make heads or tail of which one is actually true, and people end up just picking the one that again makes them feel warm and fuzzy. There are technologies that could essentially imprint or fingerprint a digital video that would allow you to quickly compare a modification and be able to determine that it's falsehood.
Would you support maybe something like social media platforms having an enforced checksum on the veracity of posted videos to their platforms?
Well, ultimately, that's what I'm leading to is that there would have to be that. But again, you get back to the root of the question, and that is these are private industries. These are private companies that own this information ultimately when you upload it. And how can we keep up with the pace from a regulatory perspective to force them to make that? How can you force someone to think critically?
Yeah, I mean, for the problem of recreating deep face you're referring to?
Deep fakes, yes.
Deep fakes. Yeah, I mean, it's a Ready Player One kind of world coming up where so many listening sensory devices are out there that we're going to be able to recreate. Now, the good news is with so many listening and capture and recording devices out there in blockchain type technologies, we'll be able to trace every single instant moment to a certain geography and a certain time. It just becomes one big giant graph database, and so that might be able to root out these fakes later on. But I don't know. Luckily, we'll have more good technologists working on it than bad ones, and they'll be able to stay ahead.
I want to see if there's a question from the audience. Yes.
In your opinion, is Facebook a media company, and should it be regulated as one?
So the question is Facebook a media company, and should it be regulated that way? So the answer is, I don't know, because it's changing so quickly. I mean, the primary method of its sales right now are through ads. That's where it gets most of its money. And so the question is, as it blends with content in the way that YouTube is becoming more of a live streaming platform as opposed to just a recorded video platform, all of it needs to be reconsidered. There used to be such huge stovepipes between what was radio and what was television, and it was very clear in the regulations what they were. And then as we're now have content providers, I don't know. But I can't wait to get in, roll up my sleeves, and figure out what it looks like. And the question is Facebook truly a monopoly? And by that, can a near peer competitor get on? And by the way, do you have a constitutional right to Facebook? Like, it's just one of these weird things where it's become such a public forum that the question is it like a street corner? Should you be guaranteed access to it, or is it a private company that can cut you off? I don't know. We got to keep getting through these questions.
I mean, I lean towards yes. I think, if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, or quacks like a duck. Ducks don't talk.
A program.
No, I think that it's, no, I think ultimately that it is. I mean, there has to be regulation here just to prevent the abuses. I alluded to the psychological operation campaign that was the 2016 election. We need some protections. We do. It's a negotiation, though, and it has to. And for me, all of these things come back, and I sometimes sound like a broken record, but all these things come back, honestly, to having representation that is there to look out for the interests of the individual, the citizen, and not companies that are looking to make money one way or the other off of it. They're going to make money no matter what regulation you ultimately come up with, but we're really entering an era where it is preeminent that we protect the individual. Personal individual property and privacy, and to some degree that means protecting them. I don't want to say this, protecting them for themselves from misinformation, from deliberate misinformation. It's a little easier to do that if it's coming from a foreign source, but we have so many domestic vectors as well. It's a tough call.
Do you think it's a media company?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it is, especially considering that, even now they have Facebook Watch, which is literally streaming media content to people based on their algorithmic preferences and so on. So, I would say they are, and so is YouTube, and the fact that there are so many eyeball hours on those platforms really... It means that it's something that, at least in my opinion, it's something that the government needs to really consider in terms of how can this media environment be conducive to a democracy.
And just to chime in here real quick, this conversation about are they a media company or are they not? Well, what it actually reminds me of a lot is the debate around open access around networks and net neutrality. Specifically, there were a number of decisions by the FCC in the 1970s that ultimately established the idea of that the actual selling of enhanced network services needed to be partitioned as a separate financial and business entity from the owner of the pipes themselves. So maybe a separate legal entity for the media piece of Facebook?
I mean, it's an idea. It's hard to come up with a solution on the fly. Although you did say something that piqued my interest, and that is we're looking at another Brave New World sort of issue here called algorithmic segregation.
Oh wow, you literally jump right into another one of the questions I have. So I'll go ahead and
well,
just say it.
Go for it.
Which is, what laws should govern facial recognition algorithms to prevent privacy abuses and algorithmic discrimination? Specifically, when we, as you alluded to earlier, Joseph, London has a lot of cameras everywhere. We are hearing about these very disturbing citizen scores using facial recognition cameras in China. What are your thoughts about, I mean, I don't want to go hyperbole, but seriously, how do we not get to 1984 here? What does the law need to do to safeguard our rights around a camera anywhere instantly IDing who you are?
Well, again, I come back to the feeling that you should be able to opt out. It should be your individual right to privacy, and that includes your location. I mean, right now, you're able to turn location services off on your phone, and I don't believe that it's okay for a governmental entity without a warrant to be able to track where you are. I don't believe that it's okay for a for-profit entity to be able to track where you are, or to serve advertisement, localized advertisement to you because you walked into a mall. I think that's something that should be a very specific opt-in in that regard.
Yeah, and I'll pick that up from where Steve had it, which is, I do believe that the opt-in side of that is a wonderful place. I mean, I do want it so that when I am walking in a space where they're trying to heavily advertise to me, whether it be through a mall or through a public location, that I would love it so that as I'm looking around, I know exactly which places have my favorite food or which places have my favorite drink or beverage or music or whatever it is. So I see huge upside potential to it, but I just want to make sure that we understand we can either do this from the aspect of the rabbit or the turtle. Two different ways to do security and privacy. That of the turtle is to make sure that everything is so protected and so locked down. You have this big heavy shell, but the problem is you do move slow. The other side of that philosophy is you move like the rabbit, which is you just move faster than the bad guys in such a way that you stay out ahead of it. And I don't necessarily have any good examples to the point of what you're talking about specifically with the segregation piece, because it is a problem, but it's just reflecting society already. And unless you go out of your own social circles, birds of a feather normally flock together. It's societal, we're tribal by nature. We just have to, as people, be disciplined to move outside of our normal comfort zone, because if not, technology is ready to serve up to you everything that they think you want to see. We just have to push back about that as individuals.
So would you maybe think that we need to have some regulations around, say, AI training data sets so that we don't reproduce society's biases? We recently heard the story of Amazon created a resume AI that ended up discriminating against female applicants because it was given bad training data.
And that was the and that was actually the test case that I was thinking in the back of my mind when I brought it up is you're now seeing resume scrubbers that are going through, and there are people that are not getting to the top because of this algorithmic segregation or discrimination. A lot of this also plays into the digital divide, which plays into your rural broadband initiatives and investment into those areas. There's so much interconnection here, as you guys know, but the fact of the matter is, we're talking about groups who are on the wrong side of the digital divide, being ultimately living in a completely different universe. You know, it's already happening when we see where someone who disagrees with us politically, let's say, on a recent Supreme Court decision, and you're just like, are you on another planet? The fact is, they kind of are. They kind of are, and people always bring up, well, you watch this and I watch that, but it's far more than that. It is what they're algorithmically served based upon their predilections, or the information that's already been brought, their psychographic and demographic information. And so we have to make sure through using things like fact checking, I like our idea, by the way. That's
Yep.
great. But we have to start looking at those technologies, and I think Joseph will agree with me on this. The fact is, if you're looking for a regulatory body to do it, it's the turtle.
Yeah.
It's not the hare. It has to be you guys. It has to be y'all that has to get out front of that and make sure, and the free market is going to have to provide those defeat mechanisms, because you can't look at a bunch of people up in the U.S. Senate who haven't figured out the Google yet
The interwebs
to come up with these solutions for you.
What are your thoughts on the proper implementation of police body camera programs to promote transparency while preserving privacy? Because there's a lot of questions around, well, how long do you retain the data? What do you do about, say, maybe somebody who's in witness protection caught in the background of the camera, or a camera catching a private space? At the same time, what do you do about if it's implemented where cops have the will to turn it off whenever they want, and it's not determined via algorithm or software? What are good policies that we should have surrounding police body cameras?
So first of all, I think that body cams have done a lot of good in society to prove that most of our law enforcement personnel are doing the right thing. The body cams are also good because they're proving that there are still some small percentage bad actors, thank you, in our police force and our law enforcement that are indeed doing the wrong thing, or more importantly, lack the training that we can fix. So, keep the body cams, make it so they can't turn them off easily. I'm sure, and I know there are privacy issues, but I want to first flush out the problem that we have real instances of abuse by law enforcement that, as we know, is often directed at people of color. And so if we can use those body cams to protect the law enforcement that are doing good and expose those that are doing bad, let's fix that problem first, and then we can go deeper into some of the other issues that we might have.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just build on what Joseph said, and that is, I think a lot of the times when you see police brutality issues, I always think back to my military training, and there's more than just tactical training involved. There's mental training. There's a development of a greater command awareness of your actions and how they will affect the population and the overall mission. And body cams provide a really good feedback mechanism for commanders to be able to find points where things can be training. And I'm not talking necessarily about those dramatic things that make the news. I'm talking about the smaller, finer points, like watching the game tape on Monday with the team. There's a lot there, but when it comes to privacy for the police officer, for instance, I think there should be a way for them to turn it off to use the bathroom, for crying out loud. I mean, that's the example I've heard before, and that's very true. But there also has to be serious teeth behind abuses of that. If they have been shown to turn that off because out of convenience, because they want to step outside the appropriate operational boundaries, then there needs to be serious consequences for that. And I also believe that when you turn that camera in for the upload, that upload needs to go into the to the custody of IG or of internal affairs, if it were. So a separate organization whose purpose is to oversee proper conduct.
Do you believe there should be laws and regulations in place governing when and where law enforcement agencies can use surveillance devices like license plate readers and stingrays?
Well, they're already in use. I mean, there's no question, and a police officer really is able to call in any license plate that they want right now. And so a license plate reader effectively just gives them the ability to do that at a much larger scale. Again, it comes back to these technologies are going to be there. You can do your best to try to regulate their use, but ultimately that regulation comes down to whether or not you are properly prosecuting abuses. If they're
interject one second.
Sure.
So what would be your thoughts on what would be an abuse? Because I think back to, I'm blanking on the name of the Supreme Court case, but it was around 2012. It was the one around the Levels nightclub in Washington, D.C., where the police surveilled a gentleman who was, admittedly, he was a big drug dealer in the Washington, D.C. area, But they, without getting a warrant, they surveilled him. Well, actually, they did get a warrant, but they misfiled the warrant. But for 28 days, they surveilled with a tracker on his car, literally everywhere he went. And when it reached the Supreme Court, one thing that Justice Roberts pointed out was saying, that the law enforcement tried to say, well, yeah, the warrant wasn't valid, but it doesn't matter because this is no different than what was established in the 70s. If we have one of our field agents manually tailing the car, this is just that, but more efficient. And Justice Roberts was like, you don't seriously expect me to believe that real-time data with minimal effort to obtain it over a whole month of everywhere this guy went, including church and apparently in a affair he was having, you don't mean to tell me that's literally the same thing.
No, and you're right, and I would side on Justice Roberts with that. I think that was illegal, illegally obtained information, and has to be thrown out. Period. But again, those laws are on the books, and they're there to protect people for that purpose.
But getting back to license plate and stingrays, how do you see that in the context of you argue, as you said, cops can legally obtain this information, but it's the scale is the concern, and the process of when should they have to get a warrant to be able to conduct operations at this scale.
Yeah, like it's troublesome, for instance, that they could drive through a mall and be able to scan every license plate in that mall parking lot, including yours, and know your location. Getting back to what I said earlier, like there should be a way that they should not be able to know your location. And I think that ultimately, from a technological perspective, that has to come down to the security and persistence of the data that's being collected. Again, you're going to have a really hard time trying to prevent these types of technologies out there because there's always that other security side that balances that equation. But at the same time, there has to be some kind of regulation as to how long they can persist that data. It has to. Ultimately, my feeling is it needs to be transient. It needs to go and do a query, and if it pulls back a warrant for a felony, then it persists. Otherwise, it's gone, and it's gone forever.
Well, this gets back to the framers, who they were among the very first people to ever really get into this idea, the right to privacy. They were so fired up and mad that British soldiers would just come into their homes and root through and turn up and search for and destroy the property. That's one of the reasons why we had the Fourth Amendment, to prevent the unnecessary search and seizure of property. That said, I will err on the side of allowing law enforcement to have the capability to use the best available technology because, oh, by the way, the bad guys and gals are also using technology to thwart and defeat what they're doing. So if we're using technology to get out ahead of it, I think that's a good thing. As to how much we should be using license plate recognition, I love reminding folks of a story that I heard long ago about toll roads. So it was a huge technological innovation when we no longer had to stop for a toll, throw money through a booth. We could just drive through and the camera took a picture. If you remember, the cameras originally were taking a picture of the whole car. And then the privacy groups came out and said, oh, that's not a good thing. You're taking pictures of people in cars. And initially lawmakers said, we don't care. We want to see who's in the car because we want to catch bad guys in action. Until too many lawmakers were caught with their mistresses in cars. And then they said, you know what? Let's just take a picture of the license plate. Let's not actually see who's in the car. And so the abuse there is not really the technology. The abuse is lawmakers choosing who does get the benefit or who is subject to these rules. And what I mean by that is they were serving their own self-interest to protect them and their mistress rather than public safety as being the first concern. So I'm going to err on the side of using these technologies, but it means we have to have lawmakers and people in office that are not abusing them. And the best way to prevent that is transparency. And that talks about having a quicker line of access to judges for the purpose of warrants and such going forward.
And ultimately gets back to the whole subject of this forum, and that is technological fluency in government and in policy making, right? And then the only thing I'd add to that is when I think about lawmakers with mistresses, I just think, who has the time?
agree or disagree that the government shouldn't be mandating encryption backdoors and devices due both to the privacy violations and the security risks such backdoors represent?
No, I mean, I have a really quick answer for that. You cannot have mandated backdoors. If the government can do it, anybody can do it, because the black hats are always going to be a little bit further ahead than the government on that. And here's the other reason. When you weigh the small percentage of need to have a government be able to use a backdoor to solve a crime or a terrorist act or something like that, because that's the one they always use. When you solve the terrorist act, first of all, you're solving it after it happened. You're not going to prevent it. But when you weigh that against the overall risk to global commerce, when you weigh that against the overall risk of exploitation to every single human being's bank account, all of the additional fraud, and the ability to bring down the entire global commercial sector, and the damage that would cause, it's a no-brainer. And I would add that when you consider that the argument on the other side of securing us from terrorist acts is being made by the same people who have shut down the FBI's domestic terrorists department. And if I need to remind anybody, domestic terrorism is far, far more the threat than external foreign-based terrorism. If you take into account that those that would make the argument that we need to use this against terrorist acts have actually shut down the FBI's domestic terrorist departments in this country, it just simply doesn't hold water anymore.
Right. Without going too much longer, I agree with Steve too. There should be no back doors, but it does bring up the issue: is what happens when Alexa, all the listening devices on our phones, when Siri and Google, and when all of them have been compromised somehow. What happens when all of that conversation has been recorded, is now released? I mean, my wife and I have been married now for almost 24 years. We each have mutual love and admiration for each other's respective mother-in-law. But if Alexa could have heard some of the snarky comments said over the last 24 years of marriage, neither one of us wants that to get out.
That's right.
And yet, that is just true of nature. It's human nature. You will say, Chris, how are you today? I really love your hat. And then afterwards, be like, he's wearing a Cops Are for Congress hat. It's the worst thing ever. And we just aren't yet prepared as a society to be as frank as that old aunt or that old uncle that has no filter on his or her mouth. And just, that's part of this issue of the back door.
That's right. My mom used to say that if we were all mind readers, we'd have all killed each other by now.
Yeah.
I mean, to briefly break my impartiality, you both just won that question for me, so thank you. So this is a bit of a follow-up question that our former EFF Austin board member Scott McCullough forwarded to me. It sort of ties into this. He wanted me to ask you guys, do you agree that all government agencies should abide by the same rules regarding system security and encryption, including backdoors, that the government imposes on private industry and individual citizens? Do you believe that whatever the laws regarding system security and encryption, that we should have a level playing field for all actors?
Yeah, I mean, we already know it's the government that gets hacked more than private industry right now, because the systems that they have were designed and built by the lowest bidder. And we also know that most of those systems were then contracted out to subcontractors. And when you do anything like that, you get the debacle like we had in 2013 of healthcare.gov, the website, which cost almost $1 billion and didn't perform on day one. And then Jennifer, what was her name? Yeah, anyway, with Code for America came in with a team of about 30 engineers living in a motel room, separate motel rooms, in Washington, D.C., rebuilt healthcare.gov in a matter of months for a fraction of the cost.
And again, I'm just going to reiterate, no backdoors. No backdoors.
Oh, we have another question from the audience. Yes, let's do that.
Yeah. So, kind of on that track record, I own a small software business, energy software, and as you know, most tech companies are built on dependencies, open source drivers, open source operating systems, servers, web frameworks, all that sort of stuff. I am really scared that a lot of the vulnerabilities that my business will face will come from those dependencies. And what I don't hear is any help from the defense or intelligence agencies on closing those vulnerabilities. It seems like they love to hoard 0 days and all that sort of stuff. And so, like, not only do I have to worry about Russia and China hacking my business, I have to worry about my own government not telling me when I'm vulnerable.
Well, I love this question. First of all, let me repeat it for everybody. He's talking about all the dependencies of the open source market. You've bundled in 15 different dependencies into even a small product these days, and knowing and keeping track of each one of those is difficult enough. But having the government not actually play a role in protecting him and his software against those vulnerabilities by keeping 0 days close hold, if I understood that correctly. And I mean, I would tell you this: I go back to look for the private sector to provide that solution. We use a product called Sneak.io, for instance, that will actually run through the dependency tree and check that against the database of known vulnerabilities. I mean, that's a good example. But again, I mean, yes, the government does discover and hold 0 days for their own usage and for their own exploitation. But at the same time, there are other entities that do that. There are other entities that discover those 0 days as well, and they're private sector entities that could and should use that to their, to make money, to make those commercially available. The last thing I would add is this: I've always felt like when it comes to virus protection, when it comes to exploitation, that there has to be some industry level recognition that those type of protections should be given away for free, that they should be made available. I think the days of having a virus protection and other types of security for your personal machine or your workstations or your servers have come and gone. We need to recognize that there's a greater collective value of closing those exploits through provided standardized virus protection and security that should be made available to whatever device that you purchase. I mean, Apple's a good example because they own the hardware and the software, but that's the tack that they've taken, and they've provided, love Apple or not, I mean, they have provided a platform that makes it more or less, at least when it comes to your iOS, makes it more or less thoughtless in terms of when you get your iPhone, you have a fairly secure platform. I don't know.
And I agree with what Steve said. I'll just add one thing to this idea of vulnerability with older systems, and it ties back to your previous question. I won't say what industry it is specifically because the details are a little bit fuzzy, but in our energy sector, we still have old utility providers on the nuclear and coal-fired and even some natural gas utility providers that are still in their control rooms using DOS-based control systems that were designed 40 years ago, and that just absolutely scares the life out of me that those are such vulnerable systems and they're so critical to our infrastructure.
Wait do I tell you that the entire banking infrastructure is running on COBOL written 60 years ago. My next question for you guys is inspired by a bit of tech law coming out of the European space. Some tech law that I'm not a fan of. I suspect you guys probably aren't fans of, and I'm curious what your alternative solutions are. How can we support responsible, thorough journalism in the digital age without resorting to solutions like link taxes that do more harm than good? How do we provide the money for, reputable news outlets to doing good journalistic work? Like I think about the amazing work that The Intercept does. Specifically, we would not have known about the Kavanaugh allegations if The Intercept had not leaked Feinstein's secret reports. So we want places like The Intercept to exist. The internet makes it very hard for places like The Intercept to exist. On the other hand, a link tax would literally destroy the internet as we know it. How do we achieve what this law wants to do without breaking the internet?
Well, I think it's a wrong-headed idea, and I agree with you. I think, a link tax starts to fall into the same category as net neutrality when it comes to just missing the entire concept of a free internet. But it really comes down to a greater question of how does journalism exist and how does journalism succeed? Real journalism continue to profit and survive in this age where everyone expects information to be free. And it's a tough question, but if you're asking me ultimately if I agree with the link tax, no, I do think that that's a wrong-headed idea.
That's the right answer.
Well, I kind of figured with this crowd, but it is a wrong-headed idea because you get what you incentivize, and it incentivizes the wrong behaviors. And so, what is the answer? I don't know, but link tax is not it. I'm going to stick with that.
That's fine.
So, as someone who is not an expert on link tax, let me move to the second part of your question, which is the journalism piece. I believe the future of journalism, quite frankly, is nonprofit. We've just seen over time that it is very hard to set up a scenario in which money can be made off of journalism for profit that doesn't involve something more nefarious like clickbaiting and trying to draw you in with ridiculous stories or ridiculous pictures. And the good news is here in Texas, in Austin and San Antonio, that both are in our districts, we have two perfect examples of good journalism, nonprofit, which is the Texas Tribune and the Rivard Report. They are a new model in journalism. They are a way forward for people to think about how to deliver correct news, good journalism, investigative journalism without having to sacrifice quality and content.
How do we protect rights holders without just turning into a troll dystopia where we have copyright trolls breaking the internet and the little guy can't keep up with the takedown notice swarm?
So this goes back about 5 years, and I'm going to get some of the details fuzzy, so I apologize, but let me just make sure I get the gist of it. I remember very early on in our company, Ride Scout, when we were pre-acquisition. This was still when we were 5-6 folks, and we were working as hard as we could to bang out the code that we could. We got served notice by one of these firms that were nothing but an IP troll, in which they claimed that part of what I was doing was in violation of what they were talking about. And our way of doing it was simply to ignore them. In other words, they were so full of it that what they were hoping for was somebody that was going to take their bait and then get hooked in and then pay them a lot of money. We ignored them and we moved on. But it is a real concern that there are these people that try to take ownership of or claim that they own that they own originally the IP. But that being said, we must protect creativity, we must protect inventors, we must protect entrepreneurs, but we can't do it at the expense of people being able to have free and ready access to this content and not have to pay for every last picture you ever see or every last copy paste you put into a PowerPoint. So there has to be a balance, and I think the balance comes into commercial use. If you're trying to claim that is your own and make money off of what you're doing.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. I would just simply add the cost of stifling the sharing of information and the sharing of content is much higher than these protections that they would put in place, and who the fraction of the individuals that would protect. There are protections out there. It really just comes down to enforcement of those protections, and there are laws on the books. And as Joseph mentioned and alluded to, there are. If anything, we have a problem with litigation abuse of those things, not the other way around. I'm very much not in favor of any type of additional type of content ID tagging being a requirement by federal law or otherwise.
This next one, I'm going to end with a couple ones proposed by some of our board. This first one, I guess it'll be a two-partish question, and you can answer whatever part of it you want. But both these questions came to me from our board member, Heather Garfield. She wanted to know, what educational regulatory remedies can we apply to address the technology sector's diversity problem? How can we get more girls and minorities in STEM education and working at tech companies? And the other question is, what laws do we need to make sure that our children are protected online while not doing things draconian or inadvertently hurting victims, actually?
So I'll take the first part of your question, and I do not believe there is any government regulation that will be able to impose the diversity. I think it comes down to individual discipline and leadership. And there is no better example than what happened right here at our company, 100 feet away from where we're standing right now for this podcast. So after we sold our company to Mercedes, we had the opportunity now with a much bigger budget to build out the dream and the vision of what we're building. And Mercedes said, go, go, go. And I said, wonderful. I need like 20 engineers to do what we're going to do. And they said, great. And then I turned and also said, you know, every engineer I've worked with to this point have all been dudes. And I understand that if we're going to be able to change this long term, people will be what they can see. So more women need to see more women engineers to attract more women engineers, so that in computer science classes, it's more 50-50 and they don't feel like they're the minority or for any reason harassed out of the class. So I said in a public meeting at my company, we're going to hire 50-50 women engineers in this company. And my HR team came up and said, you can't say that. You can't do that. That's against the law. It's insisting on a hiring quota. And I said, okay, we're going to hire 50-50 women as best we can. And we tried so hard. But now the problem was, part of that was my network was limited. But even after that, out of 20 engineers we had in our company, 2 were women. So if I can't fix it by hiring, if I can't fix it by the law, then let's go back to the source. And the source are girls in the 4th and 5th grade who were overperforming their male or boy counterparts in every test score in math and science. But when they get into the buzzsaw that is middle school, where the peer pressure comes in that says, no, you don't want to be a computer nerd, no, you don't want to be smart in math and science, no, that's not what the cool kids are doing. That peer pressure buzzsaw kills that excitement and passion for math and science. And then by the time they get to high school, they've lost much of it and barely, we're not doing enough to allow them to recapture it later on in high school and college. So my wife and I, one of the very first checks we ever wrote after we sold our company was to an organization right here in Austin called Girls Start. I encourage all the listeners here to check out Girls Start, because what they do is they go to programs where girls are in the 4th and 5th grade, and they inspire in them a passion for math, science, engineering, all things tech, so that hopefully they get enough confidence that when they go into the buzzsaw of middle school, they survive it and they come out the other side just as passionate about science and math as they were before. And that can't be regulated. That can't be written into law. That can only be done with leadership and people willing to take the courage to make it happen.
I want to personally say we need more leaders like you in tech. I want to thank you for that donation.
Yeah, and we do. And I would agree. You can't regulate this, but you can provide public and private programs that can incentivize and find these young girls before culture gets to them. But I also do think there is a cultural lack. You know, we're talking about generations like my children, my 11-year-old boys. All of their female peers are just as fluent with all of the technology, and it's just as pervasive and just as part of their lives as it is the boys. And so I think you are seeing culturally you're starting to see the norms are changing, but you can always accelerate that, because you know the fact is our industry is always 1 million people short. In this country, we have 1 million open requisitions at any given moment. And we need everybody. We need women, men, and everybody. We need more. And we have H-1B programs that are bringing people from out of the country just because we don't have enough people here to do it. So any kind of public or private programs that can incentivize and help them get that training is really, I think, the answer.
Great. And I'm going to close with a final question that comes from our board member, Alex Sharastani. He wanted me to ask you guys, tech issues, are hitting center stage in politics, at a higher clip in the past. And I think as time goes on, it's just going to accelerate more and more. What tech policy issues do you both see on the horizon? What are the big things that are going to hit society like a ton of bricks we're not anticipating that we need laws to protect our rights in place for?
So where I was going with that question till the very last part, which is where we need laws to protect us from.
You can ignore that part.
No. I want to hear it, but I want to flip it. The number one issue coming down the pipe in the next 5, 10, 15 years that's going to disrupt politics we need to be aware of is autonomous driving technologies.
I like that answer.
Okay. So let me take the state of Ohio, which was a critical battleground state in our 2016 election, to give you some scope of the numbers and the context of how big this issue is. In Ohio, there are about 3,000 people that are employed by the coal industry. Coal industry is like on their Social Security return. If you figure that every industry has about an 8x multiplier of people that are working, selling them ancillary goods, you can maybe stretch it that the coal miner industry in Ohio employs 24,000 people. The way the current president campaigned in Ohio, in western Pennsylvania, you would have thought that every person in the state of Ohio was making their money on coal or from coal or were working in coal mines. And that had an outsized impact on the election because we're talking about coal and bringing back coal to go back to a fuel technology that is so much of the past. Okay, that's Ohio. 3,000 coal miners. Ohio has 775,000 drivers of trucks, cars, or vehicles of various types. So if you think we had an avalanche in politics in 2016 by people wanting to go back to the past, in this case to an older energy technology, wait till you see what happens when technology continues to advance with autonomous vehicle technologies and we have just millions of Americans displaced in the job force and the workforce by that. So that's my number one concern going forward in the future, and I want to be there not just as a technology expert, but as someone who worked in the transportation world with Ride Scout.
Before I turn it over to Steve, I have one quick follow-up question for you on that, which is, do you have a remedy for what we're going to do when a populist politician promises he's going to outlaw autonomous cars to save these jobs?
Elections matter. Make sure you vote in November.
That's right. You can't protect the buggywick industry. And
Yeah.
That's the way it is. And I'm going to put Joseph on the spot and ask you: Did you read that book that I sent you, The War on Normal People? From
Not
Andrew
yet.
Yang? It's all about that, and that's why I sent it to you. I think you'll really enjoy it. But autonomous vehicles are the big forward threat, but there's actually others too, and we do focus on that because, again, driving a vehicle is the number one employer of a non-college educated male in the United States of America.
And I believe that estimates estimate that, and this is not ancillary people, as Joseph alluded to, driving directly employs 6 million people in this country. 6 million.
It's enormous, and it is. I mean, we're talking about a major displacement here on the scale of the Great Depression that no one in Congress or no one in Austin is even talking about, because they're not even aware really of the true ramifications. I'm going to build on what he said there and just say that when you start believing and realizing that the vehicle, the four-wheeled vehicle of the future is a service and not a personal possession, we're talking about a disruption of the automobile industry now. And when you start thinking about artificial intelligence and you start talking about not future stuff where you fall in love with your phone, I'm talking about the stuff that they have right now, IBM's Watson, that can already identify the beginnings of cancer cells in radiological x-rays and CT scans and compare them to millions at a time faster than a radiologist can? Or are you talking about the same type of AI that can compare do comparisons that an associate lawyer can do in a heartbeat, that it would take them weeks and weeks. We're looking at white collar work too here that is being displaced right now.
And you actually you understate, well, just didn't get into the true snowball effect of driverless cars, which is, as you said, not only the drivers but the automotive industry. That eventually trickles up to the oil industry, which kind of runs this country in a lot of ways.
And it does. And I mean, the autonomous vehicle has so many upsides for so many people, but we have to look at who's losing on that equation, and we have to have job training programs. Invest heavily in those job training programs. The future is creative, the future is design, the future is technical. There will be other jobs on the other side of it, but it doesn't even start with investing in those job training and the education of our kids now. It starts with just talking about it, and we're not even doing that.
And I want to build on something Steve said, because it is important to see the distinction between blue collar and white collar. However accurate that is, probably isn't totally accurate anymore in society. But
right.
The point is, blue collar jobs have been disrupted, like in coal, have been disrupted in service industry, have been disrupted where technology can come in and displace those jobs. And by and large, white collar jobs, they didn't notice or care very much because it didn't impact them directly. In fact, many of their goods and services got cheaper. However, you wait till, as Steve pointed out, doctors are getting displaced, lawyers are getting displaced. Their upheaval, because they're writing the check to those lawmakers to try to put them in office, is going to have an outsized proportion, maybe not at the ballot box, but in check writing, which is why we have to be at the table talking about these issues now, because we're not going to need as many people in the legal industry, because as he pointed out, that's going to be one of the easiest areas where high-speed computing and AI are going to be able to find the discrepancies that right now humans are trying to find.
I believe we have taken up to the limit of what I said, and I know, Joseph, you have to get going, and you probably both are going to not sleep for the next 3 weeks, but I want to thank both of you so much for a really amazing conversation. Whatever comes with your candidacies in the next 3 weeks, regardless of how many people hear this conversation, I think we're all richer for having had it, because I've listened to a lot of political debates and they don't contain the substance of what I just heard from the two of you. So I want to thank both of you for running, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Special thanks to B.D. Riley's Irish Pub for hosting the event and allowing PNN to record the gathering. I'm Scoop Sweeney, and this is the Protopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.